Okay, so in terms of spelling in the secondary school, this professional learning session should provide both teachers and teaching assistants with some approaches and resources to support the progressive teaching of spelling strategies and patterns. We will share as many examples of approaches as we can, and we'll think about how they can be built into the English curriculum. And hopefully, in terms of success criteria, you will leave the session with a little bit of clarity or further clarity in terms of progressive spelling knowledge and the skills people need as writers, and then the methodology that supports their development too. In our session, we'll cover three main elements. Firstly, why is spelling so important? Secondly, what spelling knowledge and skills are necessary? And then finally, how might we support our pupils to develop their knowledge and skills? Firstly, if we think about why spelling is so important, it's clearly the case that being able to spell fluently and with a level of automaticity will reduce a student's cognitive load. We will shortly look at the writing triangle and all of the components of writing and why it's so complex. And obviously, if we've got pupils who are not fluent spellers, along with all of the other components of writing that need to be focused on at the same time, there is the potential for cognitive overload, and certainly in secondary is quite often a reason why we have very reluctant writers. Being able to spell well is closely linked to reading, writing and comprehension skills. Therefore, it really is part of a holistic foundation of literacy skills. In terms of reading comprehension, if you think about the different vocabulary that pupils need to understand, if we consider then that fluency in their own writing, being able to choose that correct spelling is really challenging, but it demonstrates their understanding of words that have been either included in a text or that they're using. And as you can imagine, what that leads to is an overall improvement in confidence and competence. Good spelling skills contribute to overall literacy confidence, and that's no surprise. This is the triangle, the complexity of writing. So the Education Endowment Foundation published this visual that really does highlight the complexity. If you think about executive function and the planning, motivation and reviewing of writing, then the composition linking to the words, ideas and sentences, and then in terms of the actual transcription of getting it down on paper or on screen, and in terms of the spelling and the handwriting, the amount of working memory that takes up is enormous. But as the EAF states, fast and accurate spelling of an extensive vocabulary is a key component of writing fluency. Many of the skills that support word reading will also support spelling, but spelling demands great specificity and has different motor demands. Right, so straight away, we know that this is a really challenging area, and I think it's probably a good point to mention that there isn't a lot of really high quality research on spelling. So what we share with you today will literally be everything we can possibly find. Okay, so sticking with the EEF for a moment, if you've seen their guidance on improving literacy in secondary schools, you will know that recommendation 4 focuses specifically on writing, and it talks about breaking down complex writing tasks. But the advice we're given within that guidance is quite generic, and really the key point from that guidance is that explicit instruction is key, and that targeted support should be provided for students who struggle to write fluently. So obviously the role of a teacher and the role of a teaching assistant would be to support that process. However, we're currently in a climate where many of our pupils enter year 7 and do not have the skills that maybe historically we would have expected to see. Therefore, it is recommended that you go back to look at the Key Stage 2 guidance, which breaks things down into slightly more granular form. So you can see we have the explicit vocabulary instruction, and that should go hand in hand with spelling instruction for it to be as effective as possible. In terms of developing the pupil's knowledge and the depth of understanding of vocabulary, which should in turn help and support the development of spelling, the study of etymology and morphology is recommended by both the EEF and by Estin in some of their reports. There is a focus on Tier 2 and Tier 3 vocabulary, so thinking about words that can be used across the curriculum on a daily basis, vocabulary that is used across school, but then thinking about that subject-specific disciplinary vocabulary for Tier 3 as well. And then obviously it does say that teaching spelling, grammar and punctuation explicitly can improve students' writing. So I think one of the key areas of focus for this session is really about how explicit we are, and are we being explicit enough? The final recommendation for writing in Key Stage 2, again, links back to the triangle with all of the components of writing and the impact on working memory. And it's just this opportunity to really highlight that handwriting and spelling and sentence construction can be redirected towards writing composition, if we know that cognitive resources are being freed up. So that is another key area for consideration. Linking with that, and I think especially for a secondary context, the link between handwriting and spelling has never been so relevant. I think we probably all experience at some point pupils with handwriting that is illegible, and that might be because they're used to using a laptop. They really struggle with the transcription, even holding the pen, and find letter formation really difficult. I think this year the WJC did state that they had the highest proportion of pupils being ungraded in qualifications because their scripts were illegible. So it's clearly a major issue if it's affecting Key Stage 4 outcomes, and something that we still need to continue addressing much lower down. I've put the link into the National Handwriting Association there. There are some free resources if that's another area that you think would impact on the accuracy of spelling for some of your pupils as well. In terms of the curriculum for Wales, it's quite obvious that spelling is absolutely integral to pupils being able to express themselves clearly, and for pupils to be able to communicate clearly as a life skill, not just in LLC, but everywhere. So we know that that is going to be really significant in terms of pupils being able to be effective communicators in a range of different contexts. Without talking too much about the literacy framework, just to highlight that the guidance, firstly, in the curriculum for Wales provides guidance relating to words and phrases and the letters and sounds they represent for progression step 1. In terms of the literacy framework, that corresponds to this idea of being able to form letters and being able to segment words into syllables and sounds to help me spell. So if you think about learners or pupils starting that at the very first stage, progression step 2 then gives us lots of different information in terms of what pupils should be able to do relating to phonics, spelling, appreciating, the consonant vowel consonant pattern in most words, looking at digraphs, so sounds with 2 letters, identifying and being able to use simple roots, plurals, past tense of verbs, and then attempting more difficult words using a range of strategies such as word families, roots, morphology, graphic knowledge, and phonic knowledge. By progression step 3, as tailed off in the Curriculum for Wales guidance, the literacy framework gives us some further guidance. Again, in terms of progression, looking at the spelling of polysyllabic words, complex and irregular words. There's not much more in terms of the guidance there. And then for progression step 4 and 5, as anticipated, nothing in the Curriculum for Wales documentation, but the literacy framework does really highlight a specific focus on the ability to spell familiar and unfamiliar vocabulary across the curriculum, and to be able to use a variety of strategies to spell those tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary as well. So by progression step 4 and 5, it's very much assumed that all pupils will have all of the skills and experience they need to be able to spell a vast array of words. We know that's not going to be the case. And we're probably in a position where in some cases we will need to look back at progression step 1 and 2, depending on the ability of our pupils. So before we move on, a very quick question. Did you know the average literate person has a vocabulary of about 50,000 words? Generally, about 48,000 of these can be spelled correctly. If we plan to teach children each word they would need to spell, and we try to teach them 10 words a day, and we had about 200 school days per year, how long would it take? 24 years. So it really is enormously challenging for teachers and teaching assistants. And I think what this also highlights is that pupils need to have strategies to be able to take that level of independence, whereby they're able to develop their own knowledge and strategies for vocabulary and spelling. So, why spelling? We've covered that. Moving on now to what do our pupils need to know and to be able to do. So, firstly, phonological strategies. As noted in progression step 1, 2 and 3 of the framework in particular, phonological strategies require a huge focus in those earlier years of development. So phono means sound, voice. Logical means the study of. So it's no surprise that phonological means the study of sound. And what we're looking at is voice sounds in words and the letters that represent them. With morphological strategies, we're looking at the shape and the study of shape. So we're looking at the shape or the parts of words and how different words are built by different morphemes. Etymological strategies, the true sense of the word, etymological, the study. So we're looking at the study of the origin of words and their development over time. And if that is really blended with the explicit teaching of morphology, then it enables pupils to develop a much deeper understanding of vocabulary and really enhances their ability to be able to make connections between vocabulary as well. Finally, orthographic strategies. So ortho originates from the Greek for correct. Graphic is also from the Greek writing, so, or drawing. So orthographic would mean, the actual transcription, being able to transcribe those letters onto paper, but also being able to recognize what is correct. So my first question would probably be, and it is a rhetorical question, there's no need to answer, it's just food for thought. Does your school use a phonics programme? During the course of the last couple of years, secondary schools always tend to have phonics programmes such as Fresh Start for nurture or lower ability classes where pupils have extensive gaps in their phonics learning, which obviously impacts then on reading ability and comprehension, with a clear knock-on effect for writing as well. But as I'm out on my travels around the region, it is quite obvious that more schools are now engaging with phonics programs and not necessarily just for those groups of learners. In some cases, it's becoming a more mainstream approach with some Year 7 classes in particular on that transition. So, if there are gaps in knowledge, historically speaking, there will be probably a large number of secondary school English specialists who have never received phonics training, because that's not part of what the secondary setting focuses on. The assumption, I think, has always been made that pupils will arrive with that detailed phonics knowledge, and there will always be a core group of learners who maybe need some further assistance with that, but it is more widespread. So it might be a case of tapping into any resources you may already have in school, or maybe speaking with your colleagues about whether or not a phonics program would be a step in the right direction for you moving forward. In terms of phonological strategies, pupils would need to be able to segment a word, so listen for each sound, the phoneme in the word, and represent each sound with a letter or a combination of letters represented as a grapheme. As a strategy, this continues to be a focus for pupils in later primary and early secondary years as the range of grapheme choices become greater. So just to highlight, if you may not be familiar with phonics, I wasn't until quite recently, but the phoneme is the sound and the grapheme are the letters representing the sound. So for example, sh. So you've got the graphemes represented by BRU, but then you've got obviously sh is a digraph. Is that correct, Catherine? Yes. Right. So we have the two letters represented in the sound as well. Obviously, you can have 3 letters, 4 letters, and it does become very complex. I think pupils will automatically go through that process, but if there are gaps in their phonics knowledge, then they will probably not be making the correct sound, and they will find it very difficult to select the correct grapheme to match the sound. So therefore, we have a spelling issue. Okay. Then syllables, then phonics. So it may be that you start by recommending that the pupil separates the word into syllables, and before segmenting each syllable then. So you would identify the phonemes in each syllable and then decide which grapheme represent them and note them down. So for example, in terms of syllables, in to net, so you've got your 3 syllables, but then you would break them down further into the phonemes. I'm sure Catherine will give me some feedback on my phonics later on, but I'm sure you get the gist. And I feel that in thinking about my own practice and reflecting, I would attempt to do this, but I think I probably would have been more explicit and more rigid in the process had I had improved phonics knowledge to start with. So it may be an area for development for some of us moving forward. Just to reinforce that, this is just a quick visual of how these can be explored with different animals. Again, reinforcing the phoneme and the grapheme and the correspondence between them. So if we just consider really quickly, we have a lovely picture of a cow there. How many phonemes are used to sound out the word cow? 3. C-A-C-O-W or K-A-U. No, it'd be 2, isn't it? It's 2, sorry. K-A-U. 2, thank you, Catherine. Notice I did self-correct though, so that's a bonus. Right, in terms of the graphemes that correspond with the first phoneme, it could be a C, it could be a K, it could be the digraph CK. Right, so straight away choices need to be made, and I think this is this is highlighted by the complexity of the examples at the end of this. We've got school and mosquito, and obviously that makes the same sound, the hard C, but it's spelt completely differently. So again, it's just really highlighting the complexity of the English language. In terms of the graphemes that correspond with the second phoneme, then we have ow, spelt in two different ways, and then the word drought at the end, which would bring in that four-letter grapheme, which is far more complicated again. So pupils are expected to have all of this knowledge, and sometimes we maybe think that they have all of this knowledge on arrival with us, but they don't. So we don't have to put any spellings in the chat, but if you just look just for a moment at the different combinations of letters that could be used to spell cow, which is a very basic word, I think it just highlights again that without this knowledge in place to start with, we are going to see common spelling errors and very frequent errors as well. So this table demonstrates the phonemes to graphemes, a chart basically that could be printed out to support you. I certainly think that if, in terms of being a teaching assistant, it might be useful to have a copy of these that you carry around throughout your day, depending on whether you're supporting small groups or an individual. It may be a good point of reference to be able to remind them of the phonics and to be able to talk a little bit more explicitly about phonemes and graphemes with them. And again, consonants and vowels. So you've got your phoneme to grapheme correspondence, but then your grapheme to phoneme correspondence. So obviously with this, just for writing, but in terms of reading and being able to segment words and sound out words and develop vocabulary, I think it's probably quite a useful tool, unless you've got a scheme in school that you can use resources for supporting pupils in class. Okay, so in summary, for phonics, it's really about ensuring that pupils have that knowledge of the consonant and the vowel phonemes. Many will, some won't. So it's about practicing the sounding of the phonemes all the way through words. Now, I'm not sure that we're particularly good at this all of the time in English. I think maybe if we consider Welsh and international languages as an example, in terms of the way their pedagogy focuses heavily on oracy and the chanting and the repetition of words, I think sounding out the phonemes, even with the tier 3 more complex words, is only ever going to be a positive in terms of the impact on spelling. You can focus on the identification of common digraphs. You can look at trigraphs and you can look at quadraphs. So that's just looking at those graphemes with 2 letters, 3 letters, or 4 letters. And it's a case of practicing and making sure that you're really explicit. This is probably a good opportunity just to introduce to you the spelling overview, the EAS spelling overview that my colleague Catherine McMahon and myself worked on over the summer, really drawing resources from a range of sources, but also using the GLANASC primary spelling strategy document as a basis for the creation of our own. GLANASC referred to the English Programmes of Study for Key Stages 1 and 2, but we've also referred to the English programmes for Key Stage 3 as well, just to really highlight that continuum. You will have access to this document, and I think it's probably a pretty good document for dipping in and out of if you're identifying with groups of learners or individuals specific spelling strategies that they could do with some help on. So to give you an idea, if you look at the top, for example, you've got the soft C sound. You've got information relating to when it would be a soft C in a word. You've also got a list of vocabulary that uses or utilizes the soft C. What we've also done is highlight certain words in red if they are part of the single word spelling test. So if that is a resource that you use, you can cross-reference that with this resource. If you feel that you could do with some teaching resources, then the final column will give you links directly through to just a very quick opportunity to address the spelling pattern with some activities. And, I'm sure that's something that, you can build on as you go along, but it does provide you with a starting point. So you could use some of the words for, for example, to prompt children. So how many phonemes can you hear in the word? Which graphemes do you know that match that phoneme? And then which grapheme choice do you think is most likely? And, using those prompts in a more consistent fashion. So phonics, right? We've covered that, and it's a bit of a race through it, but it's not that complicated really in terms of just establishing the basics. And I think it's more likely to have a positive impact than not addressing it at all. But I think consistency is key. Moving on to morphological strategies. English specialists will know that morphological knowledge is the recognition, understanding, and use of word parts that carry significance. So we quite often talk about root words, prefixes, and suffixes with our pupils. Again, though, do we always do that explicitly enough? We know that morphemes, these parts of words are morphemes. And they can be played around with quite a lot. So there's the opportunity actually for some fun to be had, I think, in terms of building pupils' confidence with words and therefore with spellings. So for example, we have the prefix, the root, and the suffix. So an example would be distrustful. Dis means not, but pupils might not. Trust means to believe or to have a belief in the reliability of something or someone, and then full, to be full of. Again, this is introducing the etymology. If pupils understand what the word parts mean and have that depth of understanding, they're more likely to be able to remember the spelling of it. So she was distrustful of anyone in a uniform. And the important part there is actually using the word in context. Because as we see later on, it is quite obvious that pupils can work with a word list with a certain level of competency, but then the transference of those words into their own writing can often be a sticking point. So any resources in this PowerPoint that have a star on them means that they will be included in the resource PowerPoint that you'll be sent the link for at the end. So if you want to use them, adapt them, trial them, you will have a bank of resources to take away with you. In terms of secondary school examples, it may be that you have pupils who are really clued up on your prefixes and your suffixes, and that they are focusing solely on word roots. But just an example of different approaches. Something else I think is worthy of consideration, and this really does come from two courses that EAS ran last year with Dr. Ellie Bristow, based on the teaching of morphology and etymology. It's really whether or not we explicitly discuss common prefixes. Do pupils understand what mal, re, co, en, hyper actually mean? If they're common prefixes, we know they're going to crop up a lot. Is it a case of being more explicit? It's probably an opportunity to have a wall display as well. Or would it be useful for pupils to have copies in their books if they're doing vocab work? It's just a consideration, as would be then being really explicit about common derivational suffixes. So we know that basically these are suffixes that would be used to make or derive new words. So it would be a change of from one part of speech to another. So for example, a verb to a noun, entertain to entertainment. And again, that's something that could be explored more explicitly. You wouldn't want to do it all in one go. I think some schools trials looking at prefixes, suffixes, and word roots, and maybe just looked at 3 every half term and gradually built up over time, just to see if there was any impact on people's understanding. And as a result of both of those courses, the evaluations did suggest it had a really positive impact. So again, just to signpost you to the overview, there are, in terms of morphology, specific sections on prefixes and suffixes. And again, you can see, the way that it's set out. We in secondary, just as much as primary, struggle with pupils. The pluralization of words is something that for some reason we have to keep going back to again and again. But you can see that there are, there's guidance on the rule. There are examples of words, again, highlighted, and you've got a link to resources there. So in terms of morphology, the prompts would be, can you break that word into smaller parts? What root word can you hear in that word? Can you write that part first? How does the root word change when we add certain prefix or a certain suffix? Does it stay the same? Does it change? How has the meaning changed now that you've added a certain prefix or a suffix? So it's exploring those word parts, but really explicitly. So etymology really goes hand in hand with morphology. And as I said earlier, for those of you who might be interested in doing a little bit more work on this, etymology is the study of the origin of words and the way in which their meanings have changed throughout history. And I quote Dr. Ellie Bristow when I say that research suggests that pupils understanding a word's etymology can help in understanding why it is spelled in a particular way. So the example we have here is the Latin, the modern day English for we've got 100 as the modern day English, or 100. That would have derived from the Latin cent. Okay, so if century then is a derivation of cent, as is centipede, centigrade, you can see how that word root can be used it's a very common word root, and it's used across a range of vocabulary. So starting to think about those connections between words is highly significant. And to just demonstrate that in a little bit more detail, I do have lists of bound word roots. I've got some resources, and you're very welcome to have them if they would be useful. But just to give you an example, the word or the root port, meaning to carry, originates from Latin. If pupils were encouraged to find or think about as many words as they can possibly come up with, including the word port, they would probably not come up with this list. This is my list, and I did have Google to help me, if I'm honest. But you can see that we've got port used. Once pupils understand that port means to carry, straight away in terms of their vocabulary comprehension, they're taking a step in the right direction. But also, if they can spell port, then that's an important part of the word already covered. So it's worth being as explicit as that, and you can do that for lots of different root words. And I'll show you another example of an approach a little bit later. So I've included a section from a primary school Estin thematic report, really just to highlight that I think the problems or the obstacles that primary schools face are probably not that different to ours, in the sense that pupils may not be exactly where they would expect them to be by a certain stage at the moment. But in terms of word patterns and spelling strategies, sometimes teachers don't have the knowledge themselves of how the spelling system works, especially their understanding of how morphology and etymology can support learners' spelling development. So just to highlight really that it is, signposted there by Estin as a strategy that would be useful for teachers to have knowledge of or a deeper understanding of if you've already got that surface knowledge. Finally, orthographic strategies. So does the word look right? And quite often, I know writing on the board, sometimes I'll put a word on the board and say to the pupils if I'm having a little off moment or suffering from my own personal cognitive overload, does that look right to you? I think we all have those moments, but obviously it is a really useful strategy, especially in terms of homophones, and especially of trying to memorize, that visual of what a word looks like. And the prompts really then would be, which spelling rule will help you to spell that word? What is there in the classroom to help you with that? And which of those choices look right? We rely a lot, I think, on what pupils remember. And to move on from that, the range of strategies here, I'm sure that you'll probably use some, if not all of them. But are they being used? It's food for thought, isn't it? So to write the word and write it again over the top, to write the words again and then write the words with your eyes closed. Writing the word and then writing the word over the top is really good for practicing the transcription of words, but also it's training muscle memory. So the more a pupil writes a word, the more likely they will be able to do it with that level of automaticity at some point. I know that most schools do or have in the past used look, say, cover, write, check. I would argue that maybe the say bit is not as prominent, and really that verbalization of words would be a little gap in the pedagogy in some cases that could be considered and reviewed. Exaggerating the pronunciation of the word, say it as it's spelt. For example, we have Catherine's favourite example here, biscuits. And just thinking about the sounds, those sounds, and breaking it down so that when it comes to writing, it makes it a bit easier. A common strategy is looking for little words in bigger words. So end in friend, Ron in environment, Liam in parliament, and a rat in separate. And in secondary, I think environment, parliament, and separate, and actually friend to an extent, are words that will probably have you all shaking your heads in the background there, because there's such common spelling errors. Then the use of mnemonics can help as well. So big elephants can always understand small elephants. You might also have a visual, and that links with dual coding, and that's engaging both sides of your brain in the process, so it's more likely to stick. So dual coding. Beth, I've used some of your line, if that's okay. Rainbow writing. And I just thought that was a great example of words within a word. There is a rat in separate, and we, sure enough, we have a picture of a rat, and it's been split up there. In terms of some of the work primaries have been doing, and alongside work that I know EAS has previously done as well, different strategies. We've mentioned rainbow writing. If we think about the repetition of a word within a particular shape, or using the vocabulary or word triangle to gradually build that word up bit by bit so that you're really breaking it down. And that's the same with the waterfall words there. Activities where you write the words in uppercase letters, then write them in lowercase letters, and then write them alternating, just again for that practice. We've got look, cover, write, check. And then a lovely example from Glanas Primary School. And again, this would depend on who you were working with. I'm not suggesting this would be a strategy suitable for a class of 30. because I can already imagine what it would be like. But to cut and stick letters from a magazine and newspapers to spell out words, just so that they're creating those visuals. And they're fully engaged with what they're doing then, they're more likely to remember, and they've got that to refer back to as well. Okay, so in terms of other approaches, if we think about, again, really basic models, knowledge organisers, GCSE, WJC provide lots of knowledge organisers and provide lists of vocabulary, but really we need to think about how the strategies will have developed by that point, so pupils know what strategies they can use, usually flashcards and games and that kind of thing. But this is a basic vocab model. Many of us already use the Freya model in English, and we know that you have the definition, an image, a sentence, and then non-examples. I've also seen examples in secondary schools, and something I also quite like to do was just to include the etymology of the word on the Freya model, so that that's being addressed to deepen the understanding of the meaning of the word. And again, templates are freely available online, but we've put the link in there for you. So in terms of pupils being supported to develop their knowledge and skills, it's really about that explicit teaching and the opportunities for regular practice, because really with spelling, we need them to achieve that level of automaticity so that they can really concentrate on the other factors of their writing. And we've got to think about the supportive classroom routines and environment. So again, references to the Estin report to be able to really specifically hone in on the spelling errors that pupils are making and to be able to address them. So, for example, if a pupil has spelt slipped incorrectly, would we explain or discuss with them or ask them to identify the root? Would we discuss the past tense suffix? Would we discuss the short vowel sound before the P and, the doubling of the consonants there? Dissatisfied. Again, these are just prompts, but is this something we're doing really explicitly or not? It's impossible to do it all the time, when you've got an enormous class in front of you, but are there little things we could do just to be more explicit? If we think about breakfast, break fast, but again, the meaning to break the fast after a night's sleep, and thinking about different ways of, explaining meaning so that it really sticks and becomes easier for the pupils. Another key focus, a recommendation by Estin, is to teach through investigation and discussion. So looking for rules, for example, plurals and the use of suffixes, looking for those exceptions to the rules. And we know that after really, excuse me, after a certain point, the proportion of vocabulary that learners are using does not follow common spelling rules. It's far more complex. If you think about the science curriculum and the level of words relating to Greek, it's much more challenging, and some more complex strategies and games, and really the idea of being able to memorize and use those words, it's just more important later on, I think. But in terms of developing that confidence earlier on, games such as sorting the roots by the prefix that fits with them. And again, in our overview, there are many examples in there of, vocabulary, the approach, and then the resources to support those kinds of activities. Okay, and really, again, it's linking to opportunities for regular practice. They need a large amount of practice, right? Extensive practice to achieve fluency in spelling, and it has to be motivating and engaging. We know that, trying to motivate learners, and I think more so than ever, is really difficult. So we've got to try to make it as engaging and as memorable as we can. So in terms of our own classroom environments, we need to think about the use of word banks. You know, depending on the ability of your learner, but alphabet books and posters even, if you have those nurture classes. There may be books that have been books of spellings collated by pupils, you know, depending on what you're studying at that point, that disciplinary vocabulary. There may be posters on the wall to support what to do when you don't know how to spell a word, dictionaries, thesauruses or thesauri, word games, word webs, and really it's all about the teacher and the enthusiasm and that zest for words that you can, you know, impart and use to inspire your own learners. Look, say, cover, write, check, we know is a common strategy. I quite like this, and I think this is probably quite viable with some of our learners, but just to have words, you know, and then the dice, and they have to be able to say the word aloud, read the word aloud, so they're sounding out those phonemes, and then they can write the word a number of times. Really simple. Word hunt, how many words can you make out of certain words? And again, you know, these are strategies we're probably using, you know, and it may be that we need to think more about the morphology and the etymology and how we can extend learners later on. But this is all about building that foundation earlier on. Playing Scrabble or word games where you can give scores for words. So there's that element of competition. Excuse me. And this is just an example of a vocabulary game. Apologies. An example of a vocabulary game that Dr. Ellie Bristow trialled, where pupils were developing their own vocabulary. And again, it was that creative but also competitive nature of the task that I think got pupils engaged. And she said they really, really enjoyed that. So that's an opportunity for you to have a go if you want to. It could be as simple as just counting the morphemes and just getting pupils to really think about those different word parts. Low stakes quizzing. Sometimes we do over rely on technology sometimes. I know listening to some of our primary practitioners speak this week, you know, pupils using iPads and other equipment really distracts or detracts the importance of spelling, you know, and that's something we need to consider as well. In terms of wall displays, do we have posters up with spelling rules on so that pupils have those prompts? And again, that's probably something that's a small win, but if they've got somewhere they can check rules, if they are, so they've given that the opportunity really to have that little bit of independence and check before they ask you. In primary school, they do like to use word webs. There's nothing, I know we probably have vocabulary walls in secondary school, you know, very similar, but obviously topic-based more in primary, but thinking about, you know, how we can use vocabulary walls to really facilitate the work we're doing at that point so that those words and that vocabulary is being spelled in their writing, in context, and not just as a standalone entity. I'm sure this is something Beth will speak to us about in a moment. A have a go book in primaries where pupils are able to have a go, apply some of the strategies they will already know. Does it look right? And then the teacher will give them some feedback on their attempt before it goes into their books. Really focus on, right, there is a lot of negativity around, oh, I can't spell, I'm not a very good speller, but actually if we just focus on the positives, I don't think, you know, in secondary live marking as you're walking around really busy, but just underline the bits that they got right so they know which part they need to focus on. It's an example from Risker Comp here, where they've broken the word down into syllables to start with, and just, you know, omitted or highlighted the omission on the pupil's part so that they can address the tricky bit. Again, it could be that, the tricky bit is just highlighted, and highlighters are used to create that, that visual emphasis as well. Trying to get pupils to really foster the independence we want them to. It's got to start somewhere, maybe, on arrival in year 7. Hopefully they will be used to some of these approaches in primary. But is there a word wall or a vocab wall they can check? Is it in their have a go book? And actually, have they had a go? The fear of getting it wrong can be overwhelming for some pupils. So that in itself, might be a massive positive. At Newbridge Comprehensive School, they have spelling booklets, a range of booklets to last throughout the year, focusing on spelling patterns. That now lists are initially provided, but then pupils are encouraged to write and highlight the tricky part, chunk the word into syllables, write the word from memory. And I think it's key to note that pupils then have to place the word into context by writing a sentence, and then they would complete a close exercise, again, placing that word into context, because it's quite often the transferring of the word into their own writing that becomes problematic in terms of spelling. Link back to some of the work Dr. Ellie Bristow did with us on etymology. I know I talked about being explicit about the teaching of prefixes and suffixes and their meaning. And we did look at the root word sent. That is duplicated here, but with an extension of the task. And you can see the pupils are given the initial sen as the root. They've created as many words as they can containing sen. Then they've chosen grade, and they've built a word list with the word root grade, and then they've gone on. The teacher would steer this, and the teacher would always pre-planned it so that the teacher knows where it's going, so that it does actually work. But this was trialled as part of the etymology and morphology projects, and Haley in particular ran an inquiry on it. And if anybody would like to see the write-up of that inquiry, then just let me know. But it is really interesting. And again, in terms of the data that was gleaned from that trial, there seemed to be a positive impact on word understanding, and with a knock-on effect with spelling then. Being a word detective, I know this is spelling years 7 to 9. We're bound to, in English, at some point, look at a text. And you can see here where an extract from the text has been used, with the words nervously then used to model the breakdown in the box. So nervously, what each part of that word means, and then with a full definition. And that would then lead into the pupils attempting to follow the same process, and in this case with the word diaphanous, which means really thin and clear, almost. I would say translucent, but I probably need to look that up for the word parts as well. But again, it's that willingness to investigate and find out more about words. And generally, pupils respond really well to this. The more they know, the more connections they make between words, the depth of knowledge they have, the better spellers they are. And that was basically what Alex Quigley has said as well. That wasn't word for word, but I did just summarise his view on vocabulary and spelling together. So finally, an example taken from Teach It, and I know we all look through these sites, but I thought this was quite a nice resource in terms of just encouraging pupils to think about what works best for them, because we need them by Key Stage 4. We need them to be independent. So it's a range of strategies: brain training, break it down, make up a mnemonic. But it does allow them to think really about what works for them, and then to engage with the strategies that work for them the best. I know at Key Stage 4, we always put a massive focus on flashcards anyway, in terms of knowledge. Flashcards for spelling isn't necessarily a bad thing either. Okay, so final comments from me before I hand over to Beth is really that sometimes pupils do struggle with spelling homework, and they can find it a little bit demotivational. It has the opposite effect, but what we need to be able to do is for them to transfer that knowledge. So spelling lists are great as part of a much broader strategy. It shouldn't really be the only thing you do if you want to see that longer term impact. I think if we use Glanusk Primary as an example, because it is a good example, how they know their learners are progressing in spelling. They do have a weekly spelling test focusing on tier 2 to 3 vocab. Obviously, the daily observations, the marking and the feedback allows teachers to identify, themes for on the boil pedagogies. And then, so that's the formative, the ongoing, and then summative. They use the Helen Arkle spelling test twice a year. And it provides a spelling age. So obviously they start and have their baseline at the start and look for that improvement later on. They'll have a high frequency word spelling test termly. They have fresh start phonics, read write ink assessments that they can make reference to. But I think the key part here is the cold write, the writing journey. And I think cold writes are being talked about all of the time at the moment. And I think if some of you are in a school where you are part of Daisy Christodoulou's comparative judgment process as well, you will know the importance of the cold write and really being able to see the raw ability of your pupils. And I think in terms of spelling progress, it's about those opportunities to see that spelling in context, in an independent writing piece where pupils have that opportunity to demonstrate their skills. And from that, you should be able to assess, in a really holistic way. You're looking at writing holistically, but really to be able to focus on the spelling as well. I don't think we can emphasize that any more than we already have. And I know that, Catherine would agree with primaries as well, that cold write is invaluable. So very quickly, there is a spelling activity bank that you will be able to access. You'll have the link to it. There are some blank templates. I think if people are keen to have any of the morphology or etymology activities, then if you just let me know in the chat, and I will be able to email those out to you or set up a folder with a link for everyone. That's no problem at all. And you have just listened to an hour of just me. So now is an opportunity, I think, for us to consider the bigger picture. And Beth Williams joins us from Isloin and has very kindly agreed to share the spelling journey at Isloin so far, because this is a priority for them this year. Afternoon, Beth.
Hi, thank you. You're right. Have I got control, Leanne, or will you flick through for me?
I will give you control now.
Okay.
There you go. You should have control.
Amazing. Thank you. So if you don't know me, I'm Beth Williams. I work head of literacy, and sort of spelling has been on our agenda, I would say, for the last 18 months, but it sort of took us a while to get going with it, because it's so massive, and I think as a result it can feel really intimidating, and my sort of fear, and I know this isn't very good to admit to, but well, are we going to make any progress with it? Are we going to just set ourselves up to fail? And then when someone goes in and says, well, you've put a lot of time and energy and resource into spelling and it's no better, does that look even worse than not addressing it? So it took a little while to get going, but I do think we're sort of certainly on our journey now. So Leanne just asked if I'd share a couple of things with you that we've focused on so far. So the main areas that we've looked at are professional learning for all our staff, because a lot of staff feel really out of their comfort zone with spelling when they're not specialist teachers. A lot of our staff don't feel confident with their own spelling, and those so then they try and avoid it. And we knew that we had to address that if we were going to address spelling. Actually, when Leanne was talking about the challenging words in science, it reminded me, actually, I did like a little learning walk as part of a journey at the very beginning, and that I was looking at was any examples of teaching spelling. And then I sat at the back of the science lesson while someone thought, right, I'll do a spelling test because she's coming to watch spelling. And he was, one of the words they were being tested on was plateau. And I was there like, oh, God, I'm not 100% certain from the top of my head. And then he was sounding it. So he's gone, think now, plateau, plateau. And I think they're never going to get to that spelling with it out. So it was a real eye-opener in terms of the need for professional learning. He was trying his best, but he just didn't have the skill set at that point to address that. The other area then, and Leanne's already referred to this quite a lot, is that encouraging that ownership from the learners to take a little bit of ownership, try and bring it higher up in the sort of priority list for them. One of the things that I've really observed, and I'm sure it's not bespoke to our setting, is that, you know, a few years ago, one of the most sort of heard things was, Miss, how do you spell? Miss, how do you spell? Miss, how do you spell? And actually, I hear that much less now. And I don't think that's suddenly that their spelling's got better. In fact, the data is telling us that it's got worse, but that they just don't value it anymore. They don't think it's important, so they're much less likely to ask. So getting them to realise that it mattered and getting them to take that ownership of their spelling accuracy was a real high priority for us. And then finally, we're much more sort of at the beginning of this journey, but developing a cluster approach. Our cluster primaries were saying the same thing. They had all the same concerns over spelling, and so it seemed to make sense to have some time to talk about this together and come up with some sort of shared approaches. So the first thing that I did, and this is nothing sort of revolutionary, lots of schools have got these now, and actually some very similar ones, is that we generated a list of our 100 keywords, our core words as we call them, those sort of really common errors. So I used the sort of WJC English language list, the dirty, I think they used to call it, looking at the high frequency words, looking at people booked in book scrutinies. Departments were actually asked to share words as well. So some of these words will also be department focuses, but with overlap and a lot of departments just saying the same word, then that became part of the list. And I tried sort of group them into difficulty. It's not an exact science because obviously everyone's got different areas of strength. And then I color coded them. So the result of that is that we've got basically 10 lists of 10 to focus on. I was really reticent when we started this journey. Our head teacher was really fixated that he was going to, he's next head of English, really fixated on it being 100. And I felt 100 was too many. And I was like, but some of our pupils are just never, if you're looking at an ALN learner, they're never going to get to 100 words. And so is that really demoralizing? And we went back on forth on this for so long that we sort of met in the middle of setting them into groups of 10 so that at least something achievable for them. So if someone is working on that first list of 10, don't worry too much at the moment for getting 100. Work on that list of 10, get the red list right, and then once you've got that list right, you can start looking at the orange list and hopefully making it a little bit more achievable for our learners with like varying skill sets. The 100 core spellings, just having the list isn't going to fix it. So one thing we've agreed is to test on it 3 times a year. So we only started this halfway through the last year. So they did 2 tests during the course of about a term and a half, and we could already, the average score went up about 9%. So clearly it's starting to work. It did dip again a bit then in September because they had 6 weeks off, and obviously they're not doing them all the time, they're not seeing them all the time, but hopefully if we keep sort of drilling these 100 words, then we will continue to see that improvement through the course of each academic year. Scores are tracked, and the first list with the score of 6 or below becomes their focus list. So the English teachers take responsibility for this in our school, and rather than just put a score out of 100, they put a score for each 10. And then we've got a tracker, which means that they're all given a target list. they're shared with them and with parents. And then once a fortnight, they are tested on their focus list. So if they can get to 10, they've got to get up to 10 out of 10 to pass on to the next list. And once they get 10 out of 10, they move to their next list, which might not be the next one sequentially. It might be the next one they had 6 or less in. If then they get to a point where they've got more than 6 in all of their lists, they start being a little bit more specific and looking at lists where they got 7, 8, 9 out of 10. So they do that fortnightly in their English lessons. So there was something quite achievable in it. And actually, parents generally have quite liked this. I think spelling is one of those things that parents worry about. They see it and they think a lot of our parents would say in parents' evenings, it's like, oh, you know, what do you think of this spelling? This has given them something tangible to say, look, yeah, this spelling isn't fantastic. They're working on this list at the moment. If you could be practicing these with them at home, then that would really benefit them, and give the parents something tangible they can help them with was really helpful as well. On top of that, then we have a fortnightly whole school focus. So this is Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, where I've just split those words into 20 alphabetically, and they take part in a quizzes test for it. So I don't know if you've used quizzes, but it's similar to like Lookit, that sort of online quiz that they can do. But the good thing with quizzes, which is why we went for this one, is that it gives you a percentage accuracy for the class. So it would say, oh, you know, this class in this test had 79% accuracy. So what we've done is they repeat the same test for 3 consecutive weeks with the aim of their class average, their accuracy going up, and then the form class that gets the most increase gets a box of chocolates. It's not very healthy schools, but they like it. And the other thing that it does is it gives you the most common error. So for example, if accommodation is the word that the class have most commonly misspelt, the form teacher then adds that word to their form board. So they will come up with some of those strategies that Leanne was showing earlier, of maybe breaking it down into syllables, or looking at a word root, or a little mnemonic, or whatever it is that is going to help with that word, having some form of display of that word on their form board, taking it from them for the next test, so that hopefully they're building their skill set. And it also means that I can look at that data and work out our most commonly misspelt word as a school. So that means then that I can have some sort of display on we've got TVs in our corridors, so I can have some sort of display on those as well, so the pupils are seeing it spelled correctly much more than this correctly. And I think that's one of the shifts that we've probably seen in the last 10 years, is that pupils sadly are spending more time looking at incorrect writing, whether that's on TikTok or Snapchat or whatever, than they are correct reading. So we know that that has an impact on spelling. So just them seeing the words visually around the school a lot in their school day spelled correctly is starting to see that improvement. So those 100 words split into 5 groups of 20, and we sort of sequentially work through them with 3 consecutive weeks on each list. So there's a real whole school approach to this. Form tutors quite like it because the pupils enjoy competitive. Like Leanne was saying, we've just got to try and engage them. Because I spent a long time trying to think how you do a spelling test on an online quiz without showing the word. The way that I opted for was to give the sentence with the word, but the word blanked out, and then 3 commonly misspelt versions of the word in the correct spelling. They have to opt for the right spelling. And what's interesting about that is a lot of our pupils who got the words right in their spelling test, when they saw like a common misspelling of it, would click the common misspelling. So it's just another way of them sort of remembering, oh no, it's 2 cots, 2 mattresses, or however they remember the word. So just to give you a little bit, I can share a bigger version, but I've created this spelling guide for parents as well, which we send home. So because they have a fortnightly focus spelling test, it becomes their homework for English, and we can just attach this every time with some strategies. They're all familiar strategies that Leanne was just looking through there, in terms of writing them in uppercase and lowercase, rainbow words, pyramid writing, etc. Just different ways of our pupils being able to practice those spellings at home, help the parents, because just repeatedly testing the word isn't going to help. So that's gone home to parents as well. Has been quite positively received. And then the other thing that we do is we have a focus. This is growing, so there's a few of us doing this really well, but we're quite a big department. Again, that consistency is certainly something we're going to be working on this year, for having that fortnightly spelling test become a focus lesson on spelling. So they have the lesson dedicated to learning the new list if they got 10 out of 10, or spending a bit more time on their existing list if they didn't quite get to the 10 out of 10. So again, using those similar sort of strategies, but just dedicating space in the book to it as well, so that they could use it as a reference point, and giving that time and that focus, and just sending those constant reminders to pupils the spelling matters, which is, you know, not necessarily the default position at the moment. You know, a lot of staff said to me when we were doing the professional learning, but spelling really matter anymore? And so I was like, well, absolutely do not say that in front of the pupils. We can talk about that now. But if you were sending a message of, oh, don't worry about your spelling now, or we're just doing this quickly, don't worry about your spelling, then we're sending these all the time. It doesn't really matter. It only matters in exams, so don't worry. Or it's only actually 2 marks in this question, so it's not worth spending your time thinking about it. The example that I always said to the staff was, I know, for example, I was actually in a professional, we're quite lucky in our school that we have a fortnightly professional learning slot on our timetable. So we'll be in sort of small groups of a mixed department, focus for the fortnight. And there needed to be a scribe last time, this was the other day, and straight away that paper slid to me as the English teacher of like, oh, well, you'll be scribe because I'm not very good at spelling, or you'll be scribe because my handwriting's dreadful. And so I use that as an example of saying, well, we've all been sat in training courses where someone needs a scribe, ventilating feeling. If you know you're not a good speller, we don't want our pupils to feel like that. We don't want to feel exposed. We want them to have that confidence in their writing and their accuracy. And that seemed to really resonate with a lot of the staff, actually, because a lot of them would be the people that would sort of slide that paper along to someone else and hope someone's going to bail them out. So just sending that message all the time to staff and people, spelling matters. We've got to make it, we've got to give it time, and we've got to give it space. So in terms of encouraging ownership, there's a lot of overlap between each of these. But one of the things that we looked at was self-correcting errors. We changed our marking approach. So historically, we had always written the correct spelling out, and I'm an absolute advocate for that strategy, because I was like, well, how are they going to spell it correctly if we haven't given them the spelling? They'll never find it. But the more I was reading up on it, and the more I was trialing approaches, I realized that they're not engaging with that at all. They are literally just copying it, and they're not even thinking about it. So building that independence and giving them that ownership to say, right, here are some strategies. If you cannot spell this word, you spelt it incorrectly, I've underlined the bit that's incorrect, so I've already narrowed it down a little bit for you. Here are some strategies that you can use. Meant that they had to engage a little bit more with it. They had to think about it, and hopefully then we'll make those connections for next time. So one of the things that we stipulated was that every classroom had to have a spelling station. So in its most basic form, that had to include the 100 core spellings, and departments had also generated a list of about 20 words, which were sort of high tariff errors in terms of their subject disciplines. So words like believe in RE, or government in history, etc. And those words had to be displayed as well. In an ideal setting, that would have like a breakdown in terms of morphology or etymology that might help them, or mnemonics, things like that. But as an absolute minimum, it had to have the words, so that we could say to the pupils, actually, that's one of our core spellings, or that's one of our history words, so go up and have a little look, you're going to find the answer on there. Just getting them to engage with those spelling stations so that they don't become background wallpaper that they never look at. The other strategy that we have trialed, that's another example of a spelling station. Another example that we have trialed is the spelling dictionaries, which some of our older English teachers, let's say more experienced English teachers, could remember these, and I hadn't used them in my teaching career as a spring chicken that I am. But they are actually quite useful. It's quite hard to get them in print. We had to wait a little bit of time on them. And this, I don't think, is the best one. There used to be, I think, a Collins one that I just could not source anywhere. But basically, they can look up an incorrect spelling of a word and it's in red, and then it gives them the correct spelling of the word. So it's a little bit more straightforward than looking it up in a dictionary, because if you're not great at finding the beginning of the word, that can be quite challenging. So we've just trialed it with getting 2 or 3 of those for each classroom, and the pupils quite like it. Our pupils all have Chromebooks, and they are very quick to say, oh, I'm just going to Google it, but trying to get them to go for a slightly slower approach so that it sinks a little bit better is really useful. Also, a lot of the spelling errors are in their book somewhere, whether it's in the text or whether it's in a resource that the teacher has provided or on the PowerPoint. So just getting them to look around them. Can they find it on the spelling station? Can they find it in talk to their partner? Can their partner help them? Have a look in the dictionary, and if they're still not sure, that's when they can ask the teacher, and the teacher can give that little bit of specific help then. What I spoke to in terms of the professional learning then with staff is, if you don't know, which is the fear, isn't it? It's like, what if they ask me and I don't know? Is that you model for them how, and you don't put it in your phone, you model for them, right, okay, actually, I think this is on the PowerPoint somewhere, let's have a little look, or let's have a look in our spelling dictionary together, or I think it begins with this, does this look right? And modeling some of those approaches. They don't have to know that you didn't know the answer, you're still modeling those approaches, and actually pupils seeing someone who's really clever and really successful in their mind in front of them not have all the answers is much more beneficial than going, oh, come on, that's easy, and you telling them straight away. So that actually helps them. So in terms of professional things that I wanted to get across, there we go. So breaking down the barriers. One of the things that I did as part of the kind of warm up to the professional learning cycle was I created, I don't know if you're familiar, but primary schools use like alien words. So they made up words that they will get them to read normally as a kind of reading ability. And I made up words, completely random words, and ask them to spell them, just to get them thinking about what they did to help them spell it. So did they recognize that it sounded similar to another word and they knew how to spell that word, so they used that? Or did they sound it out and use a word part? Did they recognize a part of the words in the middle that was familiar and use that? But the amount of stress that they felt when I was giving them made up words there was no correct spelling for was really alarming. And I was like, that is how our pupils feel all of the time if we're not equipping them. So encouraging teaching staff that bad spellers are probably better placed to help improve learner spelling than our best spellers who just naturally picked all those things up and didn't have to give it much thought. And we had some really honest conversations with staff. You know, I can think of a maths teacher, she said actually she's dyslexic, she had real anxiety about spelling all the way through school, and that's why she loved maths, because she didn't have to spell it. And her basic argument was, so I don't want them to have to spell in maths, I want them to have that area where they can succeed. And I thought that was a really interesting discussion actually, but that led to then going, okay, so what can you teach them as someone who's not a great speller but can spell trapezium? How can you teach them how to learn words that they can't naturally spell? And actually now she's got some fantastic displays in her classroom. She's done really well in terms of integrating some strategies that, you know, I might not have thought of as someone who never particularly struggled with spelling in school. Raise profile, I said it repeatedly, it's about giving it time in our lessons, but it's also about giving us space in our rooms. So if we've got a big spelling station, that is saying spelling matters. If we're giving it time in the lessons to explicitly teach a word that is a key word that we know that they're going to struggle to spell with in our experience, then we're sending that message all of the time. And then upskilling staff. So we've done some work on etymology and morphology to help them with their understanding, giving them some tools so they can look up things a little bit more independently. There's some great websites, etc. In an ideal world, we'd have more time on that, but we certainly begun the journey that they can start thinking about ways of integrating the explicit spelling teaching into their lessons. So each department, as I mentioned, had a specific spelling list. And then what I've asked them to do, and this is still very much in its infancy, is find opportunities. So for example, if they are, one of their words is plateau, it's not, but if one of their words is plateau, then when they teach the unit where plateau comes up, can they find an opportunity to explicitly teach that spelling in an integrated way rather than just bolt on spelling tests, which do have a place, but are not enough on their own. So they're displayed, they're tested, and we're moving towards them being explicitly taught in their schemes of learning. By far, this is the most challenging element. This is the one that staff are finding difficult to do, or they don't, I think they forget about it. They've got too many different priorities for their subject that they forget about it. So I'm constantly coming back to it, but it will take a good while to get that really consistently done. But we've seen some really lovely examples of it. This is one I gave as an example in the professional learning cycle we completed. One of the problems we have in English is they struggle with whether it's 1T or 2T when they're writing writer or writing or written. So just putting those three words up on the screen and asking them, have a little think, why do you think written's got a double T, but writer and writing have only got one? Can you think of a word that they, a rule that they might be following? Can you think of any other words that follow that rule? And I said to the staff, really, if they come up with a feasible answer to that and they can think of other words that follow that rule, then that's fine, because that's going to help them use that rule in the future. You necessarily have to have all of the correct answers for them to be able to complete some activities like that. And then finally, moving towards a cluster approach. A bit delayed. Here we go. So the first thing, we're quite lucky. I don't know if everyone has this, but we have termly meetings for each AOLE. So I attend the ones for LLC, and it sort of come up anecdotally that spelling was a problem, and no one was having sort of magical moments where something was radically changing their spelling accuracy. And we were saying the same thing in secondary school. So we decided that it was going to become a focus for us. So initially, I set it up as a separate working party, just emailed the links and said, look, I'd like to do this. If you want to do it, great. And actually, we've got 7 cluster schools and 6 of them straight away were like, yeah, we'd love to be involved. And we met. We've now decided to make that the focus of our calendared LLC meetings this year anyway. But that's what we did at the beginning. And actually, Leanne and Kath came along, which was really helpful. And for us, one of the problems was we can't use all of the primary school teacher approaches in secondary school, because the primary school approach tends to be having a rule, learning the rule, and then having a spelling test on words that fit that rule. But the problem we're facing in secondary schools is that a lot of those words, like Leanne said earlier, don't fit that rule. And so, or they need them faster than we can get through all the rules. So just understanding that the different approaches and the reasons behind them was really helpful. And they were actually like, oh yeah, that's really challenging. Oh, and they're much better than us at teaching spelling. So we've got a lot to learn from them. They were really helpful in coming up with some strategies that might help. That sharing best practice and creating that culture is so helpful. And just saying to staff, like, bring some examples along of something you do for spelling. Such a simple thing, but gave staff the recognition to say, look, actually, and they quite like the idea of like, no, you're the experts with spelling. I'm not an expert with spelling at all. I've never really taught it. It's just been one of those things in my 15 years of teaching that I've expected people to have. And they liked that they had this area of like specialism, because a lot of what we're talking about, I'm the specialist and they're not. So it was really lovely to kind of turn the tables on that. And one of the things was a have a go book. We're calling it a spelling book in Isline, but they call it have a go book, which is a really simple idea. I've got a picture there, but Leanne showed one earlier as well. So they were trying this in Trinant Primary, one of our feeder schools, was like those little green spell books, and they basically got a designated page for each letter of the alphabet. And on one side, the pupil will have a go, and on the other side, the teacher will write it correctly if they need it, with just drawing their attention like they've spelled pendant there rather than independent. underlining the error or ticking it is correct, but also getting them to write their spelling corrections in there. At the moment, they use that in humanities and English in secondary school, because one of the problems in secondary school obviously is they haven't got the same base all day, so it's another thing for them to forget to bring along. So we decided to go for English and humanities because we're all based on the top corridor. It was fairly easy to negotiate that between us, and it's a lot of hours between us as well. And we're trialing that as well as some of their approaches to spelling. And at the at this stage, it's looking really promising. So no doubt in a year I'll have a load of other feedback of what did and didn't work, but that's what's working so far for us.